Welcome, everyone. We will start the session in 3 minutes. Can all speakers test your audio?
This is Avery testing my audio.
Hello, Jorge, testing.
This is Karen testing my audio.
Hi, this is Lars testing.
Hello, this is Jeff Newman testing my audio.
Good morning, this is Chris testing my audio.
Hello and welcome to new gTLD subsequent procedures working together. My name is Justin Hall and I am a participation manager for this session. Please note that this session is being recorded and is governed by the ICANN expected standards of behavior. During this session, questions or comments will only be read aloud if submitted within the Q&A pod. If you would like to speak during this session, please raise your hand in Zoom. When called upon, virtual participants will be given permission to unmute in Zoom. On-site participants will use a physical microphone to speak and should leave their Zoom microphone disconnected. Those not seated at a microphone may use the aisle microphone to speak. For the benefit of other participants, please state your name for the record and speak at a reasonable pace. On-site participants may pick up a receiver and use their own headphones to listen to interpretation. Virtual participants may access interpretation via the Zoom toolbar. All are welcome to use the chat. Please note that private chats are only possible among panelists in the Zoom webinar format. Any message sent by a panelist or a standard attendee to another standard attendee will also be seen by the session's host, co-hosts, and other panelists. With that said, I will pass on to Patrick Jones.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to ICANN 74 in The Hague. My name is Patrick Jones, and I am with ICANN's Global Stakeholder Engagement Team. For many of you, this will be your first in-person session at an ICANN meeting. For others, you may be following today's session online or perhaps watching on delay. Or you may be an experienced participant in ICANN's policy work. Regardless of your status, you are able to participate at this week's ICANN Policy Forum. Today's session is part of our ongoing work to interact with the community during the new generic top-level domains, subsequent procedures, operational design phase. Some of you may have viewed our ICANN 74 Prep Week session on the operational design phase on May 31st. For today's panel, we will look a little closer into one issue as the team proceeds with the various outputs from the GNSO final report. The topic will center on the Predictability Framework, which will include a question and answer session describing scenarios how this framework might be applied in future generic top-level domain rounds. And we know this is the first plenary of the hybrid meeting format. And as we proceed with the panel, if you have a question, please be logged into Zoom and follow the guidance from our remote participation managers to be placed into the queue for this session. On today's panel, I'm pleased to introduce Avri Doria from ICANN Board of Directors, Jorge Cancio from the Government of Switzerland on the Governmental Advisory Committee, Karen Lentz, Vice President, Policy Research and Stakeholder Programs, Lars Hoffman, Senior Director, Policy Research and Stakeholder Programs, Jeff Newman, GNSO Council Liaison to the Subsequent Procedures, Operational Design Phase, and Chris Baer, ICANN Director of Strategic Initiatives. And before we proceed to the panelist discussions, the ICANN team is hoping to present to the community a greater understanding of the team's approach and the complexity of inputs that ICANN organization is working through in the operational design phase. Now, with that introduction, I would like to hand the floor over to Karen Lentz.
Thank you, Patrick, and welcome everyone. Welcome to those of you online, and it's very exciting to see some people here in real life. I will start our session talking just briefly to make sure everyone has the context as to this work. So the organization is currently working on the operational design phase. And what that does is it takes a set of policy recommendations, and you see the policy recommendations linked in the slide here, and makes an operational design based on those recommendations, including what resources would we need to build them, what would the risks be, what would the costs be. And the goal is to inform a decision by the ICANN board, which is tasked with making a decision on the recommendations, whether that would be to direct the organization to proceed with implementation of those recommendations or some other action. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So this is the timeline of the operational design phase. This is also posted on our SubPro ODP webpage, which you can find also noted in the slides. We began this operational design phase in January of this year, and some of the milestones are shown here. The green boxes that you see are community status updates. We have published 2 of those so far, and there will be 1 more. We anticipate where we are now with the arrow is at the ICANN 74 meeting. And 1 update that is very recent, not on our page yet, but you can see here we did make a slight shift in terms of what we're calling the pens down on drafting the operational design assessment, which we had initially posted before, estimated to be before the ICANN 75 meeting. And we've moved it to after. We thought it didn't make sense to close off the drafting before we had a chance to share and discuss some of the material at ICANN 75. Next slide, please. Finally, this is some more of the context. So as I noted, the key and where you see in the red box and kind of in the middle is a decision by the board of directors. And should that be a decision to proceed with the subsequent procedures policy recommendations to build processes for another application round, there would be many other milestones to follow. That would include drafting the applicant guidebook, forming an implementation review team. There's a communications campaign that would occur. There's a step for pre-evaluation of registry service providers. So there, you see many of those milestones that would follow once if the board were to direct us to proceed. So with that context as to the operational design phase, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Lars Hoffman, who's going to talk about the predictability framework. Lars.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I'm going to give a quick overview of the framework, what the working group, the PDP working group recommended, and some consideration around the framework that came up during the ODP to date. Oh, the slide is right. Thank you, Justin. Some historical background. The final report on the subsequent procedures noted that the predictability in 2012, during the 2012 round, was hindered to a degree due to the number of changes that were made once the program commenced. And in considering how such changes in future rounds of new gTLDs could be minimized, the working group in its final report recommended the creation of the predictability framework. The next slide, please, Justin. The framework is described in the report as a framework for analyzing the type, scope, and context of an issue, and, if already known, the proposed or required program change to assist in determining the impact of the change and the process or mechanism that should be followed to address the issue. It's a quote from the report. And therefore, the framework is a tool to help the community understand how an issue should be addressed, as opposed to determining what the solution should be. And also in bold here, the framework is obviously not a mechanism to develop policy. The next slide, please. These are some of the goals, again, that are from the final report, going to the fact that it's not supposed to develop policy. The framework is meant to complement and not substitute existing GNSO processes and procedures. The framework would not identify solutions to the issues raised, but instead is a tool to help applicants understand, and the wider community for that matter, understand what mechanisms will be used to address issues in a predictable and consistent manner. As part of the recommendations, the working group suggested the formation of a standing predictability implementation review team. I believe, Jeff, it was consensus view that it's pronounced SPIRIT, to be the responsible body to review issues that arise and utilize the predictability framework to identify mechanisms to resolve said issues. And the SPIRIT is not intended to replace the role of the council or the board or the ICANN org, but instead it will help foster collaboration with all stakeholders as needed to identify appropriate mechanisms to address the issue that may have arisen when the program has started. And so the SPIRIT, in fact, comes into place essentially when the AGB has been approved and quote unquote has gone live. Before that, during the implementation process, you may recall that from Karen's slide with the 3 color blocks, we will obviously work with the IRT in implementing the recommendation, as is usually the case or always the case for implementing consensus policies. And ultimately, the combination of the framework and the SPIRIT will create a consultative process working together, as the name of the session also suggests, that provide clarity and transparency on what mechanisms will be used to manage issues after, as I said, that arise after the applicant guidebook has been approved and is published. The next slide, please. Just a couple of process overviews. Again, these are from the final report. In the framework, issues are essentially categorized as operational or policy issues. And then operational issues are further subcategorized as minor, non-minor, or significant changes. And policy issues obviously can be those that require changes to something that is based on policy recommendations, or obviously new issues that arise that require the development of new policies. All issues, operational, obviously, and changes made to the program will be documented in a changelog. And all issues beyond minor operational issues, so non-minor and significant operational issues, may require the consultation from ICANN org with the SPIRIT in determining the best way forward, and also consultation on proposed solutions. ICANN org, ICANN board, and the GNSO Council are the only entities that might initiate consultation with the SPIRIT on a raised issue, again, to determine appropriate mechanisms to manage those issues. Other SO and ACs may raise an issue or refer it to the SPIRIT via the org, the ICANN board, or obviously the GNSO Council. And finally, ICANN org and SPIRIT will work together to review raised issues and determine then if the issue impacts multiple applicants and if the suggested change has any policy implications. And if it does have policy implications, I'm just going to add that here, then it's up to the SPIRIT to consult with the GNSO Council or to recommend to the GNSO Council what the best and most appropriate way is to address and solve those policy issues. The next slide, please. These are some of the assumptions that came up or that we made as part of the ODP. A full list of those are also on the SubPro ODP wiki. I think we'll have a link to that in the chat as well. They have been shared previously with the GNSO Council by Jeff, the liaison. And some of these we have here on the slide. No changes to the roles and responsibilities of board, org, council, or the implementation review team itself as a result of the predictability framework. The framework is there to identify mechanisms for a solution. We also assume that no issue will come before the SPIRIT more than once. again, that came up also previously on another slide. Essentially, the established GNSO processes take precedent over the spirit in the event of a conflict. And the resolution of operational issues and changes will be managed by ICANN. And once solutions are proposed, there will then be consultation with the spirit on whether that's the right way forward. And then the last slide for me. Thank you, Justin. Some consideration around the framework that have come up during our internal deliberations. Consultative processes with spirit may require additional time to resolve issues, obviously, especially when it comes to policy issues. And this could have a considerable impact on time and costs to process and application. And the development of clear and well understood criteria to categorize issues and propose changes will help to facilitate quicker processing through the framework itself. And with that, I think we're going to pass it back to Patrick for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with some questions. There will be an opportunity for the participants here to also raise questions of the panel. And I'll start first from a board, community, and organization perspective. How do you see the predictability framework operating? And what role do you see for the board, community, GNSO, and ICANN organization in that process? Aubrey, can I start with you?
Thank you. First, I got to say that anything I say is purely speculative. The board is still talking about this. The only decision the board has made so far is to have a ODP to try and work our way through this. But it is a very interesting and complex design that I sort of look at as the design that comes before the code, then the implementation, and something that we'll see work. I can see it working. I can see that it can add predictability in terms of knowing what kind of process we will follow when things go awry, when things are questionable, when there are nuances. So at this point, though, the only thing that I can see the board doing with it is trying to understand it, is getting to the point once we have the end of the ODP with the ODA, is deciding, will this work, will this not? But from the vantage point that I take as someone that has designed such systems and built such systems and eventually seen whether the code worked or not, or whether it needs to be tweaked, it does look like a promising beginning to something that could possibly help. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Jorge, can you add?
Sure. Perhaps from the GAC point of view, I think this is a work in progress. Of course, we will see how it works out. I can share some of the, let's say, comments or concerns or issues of importance to the GAC during these last years, because let's say that the tension between predictability and also having flexibility to address emerging issues whenever a new round starts is something we have been discussing for many years. I have here a collection of all the GAC inputs we delivered. So it started in 2016 when we answered first questions from the SubPro PDP working group. And we always, as the GAC, we always stressed the need of having flexibility to respond to those emerging issues. So this predictability framework gives a possible solution, and with the spirit, you add a kind of a working group structure to channel that solution. And as GAC, we have been very clear in saying, okay, this might be a way. At the same time, we have to be careful that it really provides some added value, that we don't have too much of a complexity with this. We know here in ICANN, we are sometimes prone to establish very process-heavy solutions. So we said that it should be lean, inclusive, and transparent. So we are still, I think, in this process of seeing whether this will meet those requirements. And what we also mentioned is, of course, we are talking here about the role of the board, org, and the GNSO, but beyond those, we have other advisory committees. And of course, speaking for the GAC, and thinking or recalling what happened in the first round in 2012, and part of the reasoning behind establishing this framework. Of course, the GAC will need to play a role in this process. So we've been floating some ideas of, for instance, having a representation of the GAC within the spirit, or having a GAC liaison. This was discussed in the PDP working group itself. So this is one thing we also mentioned in our last input to the ICANN board on the SubPro recommendations in June 2021, where we raised these issues. We mentioned that, of course, if there's any dialogue between any of these parts of the community and the spirit regarding GAC consensus advice, which could give rise to such activation of the spirit, we want to be involved. And it was also mentioned in this input that the GAC would be looking forward to an equitable participation of all the ICANN groups, or all the ICANN constituencies in the spirit and in this process. So I'll leave it by that. I think we are still in halfway through the process, and we will need to see how this is established. And the GAC is, of course, looking forward to contributing to finding the right middle ground between predictability, between stability and flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Before I turn to Karen and Lars, can I have Jeff, can you talk a bit about from the GNSO Council perspective, what you're hearing regarding the predictability framework?
Yeah, so I guess I have to make a similar disclaimer as Aubrey that this is not an issue that was talked about by the council at all, except as set forth in the final report of the SubPro working group, which was, at least these recommendations were all unanimously adopted. So what I can say, though, from personal and as one of the co-chairs of the SubPro working group, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more maybe in some of the later questions, but there definitely, after the 2012 round, given the number of changes and the reason for those changes, and also for one of the reasons you sort of mentioned in your question, and just remind me, Patrick, what were the parties that you mentioned? And I know Jorge brought it up with the GAC, but you said, what are the interactions between, what were the parties that you said?
Between the GNSO Council, the board, the wider community, and ICANN organization.
Yeah, so the one important element that wasn't included in the question, which is actually one of the main reasons for developing this, is the applicants, right? And so, and the reason I pointed out is not, it's not to fault the question, but it kind of was one of the reasons why the 2012 round and the changes didn't work as well as it could have, is because it really didn't consider the applicant point of view in terms of what they were going through, especially after applications were submitted. And so one of the things that the predictability framework hopefully tries to address is to try to consider some of those other viewpoints that maybe the ICANN board, the community as a whole, the council or the GNSO, even the GAC, didn't necessarily or didn't have the opportunity to really assess, because the applicants were always sort of considered last in the process. So we'll get more into this, but really I think one of the good things the SubPro working group did is collect information from applicants and really use that to help with establishing the framework. And I'm sure I'll go into some examples in some of the later questions, but I just wanted to kind of use that as an example that the parties you mentioned are all important. And as Jorge said, the GAC, but the applicants need to be considered because of all the work that they do with their application, all the time, money, and resources. And some of these changes that were made significantly impacted the business or the proposals of those applicants in a way which caused some of them to completely withdraw their applications, and others fundamentally revised the business model completely.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So the point that you raise actually is a good transition to a question for Karen and Lars. Can you take us through a possible scenario, perhaps an example of a lesson learned from the last round and how that might play out within the predictability framework?
Thanks, Patrick. Yes, as we've put together some ideas here and kind of work through the process as we see it based on the final report. So essentially, if an issue arises, a change needs to happen due to an external factor and internal factor. ICANN.org, as the leading the conduct of the process and of the program, would start identifying whether we consider that as an operational or a policy issue. And we would then also maybe start discussing already, especially only if it is an operational issue, what solution may be appropriate. And then there would be a consultation with the spirit to see if they would agree, A, that it's an operational and or a policy issue. Also to see what their view is on our subcategorization, if we consider it to be an operational issue, is it minor, non-minor, or significant. And then we would work with the spirit to finalize the solution if it is an operational issue. And we would then implement it and obviously register in the change log. If it is a policy issue, then the spirit would consult within itself to see what recommendation they can make to the GNSO Council about what's the most appropriate process, existing GNSO process, to address the policy issue. There's obviously, many in this room know, several ways: EPDPs, PDPs. There's the GNSO guidance process, the GGP. And then the GNSO would work with in itself and the wider community to develop a policy as appropriate, and that would then be implemented or included into the program when completed. I think that's roughly, I think, a walkthrough of a hypothetical example. Thanks.
Karen, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to add one thing in regard to the various perspectives that people have been sharing. And that is, when we look at this framework, it seems very complicated in some respects in having many different paths and many different kind of possible outcomes. But I wanted to emphasize that this is not the only tool we have for predictability. The PDP working group spent a lot of time on defining processes, defining criteria, going into detail so that we could provide clarity before the application period begins as to what would happen in these various cases. And when you asked, what's the role of the org, I think that's one of our roles is as we continue to advance the thinking on this is that we are building in predictability in all of the places that we can. And so the times that we would be needing to use this framework would be, if we've done it right, infrequent. And so I wanted to make sure that we're viewing this as not something we would be using hopefully every week, but this is something that's available to provide us resources and provide clarity for all the stakeholders when we have something unexpected. Thanks.
Thank you. So for everyone, based on your understanding of the framework and the examples that Karen and Lars have outlined, to what extent do you anticipate the framework will assist in achieving the end goal, which is predictability? Maybe Aubrey, can I start with you?
Thank you. As I sort of said in the beginning, the first bit of predictability is indeed the fact that we know what kind of process to enter. We have or would have if it all goes through, if it all gets decided. We need to always put that caveat in there. But assuming that it is implemented, it builds a structure. In other words, we don't find ourselves in the situation that Jeff was alluding to where there is a problem and we have no idea how to approach it. So therefore, the board had it in its lap at the time, and it put together mechanisms for trying to solve them. In this case, it's sort of saying, as long as the problems are coming through and can be understood and such, then there is a tool, in addition to all the other tools that Karen mentioned, that can be used. That is, in my mind, a first step in predictability. It does not predict the outcome of such a process. That depends on all the other aspects. But I think that that's actually an important, attribute that it could have. So I guess that's how I look at it at this point.
Jorge, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, basically, I agree with what Ari just said. I think that it's of course good to have the process on paper, to have this structure on paper. What is very important is to keep good and open communication channels between the different interested parties. So some parts of this may be covered by the process, some may not. So for instance, if a change request or some change comes from an advisory committee, as I said before, it's important to involve that advisory committee in the process, even if that's not covered explicitly in the process. But probably what is most important, so beyond the providing for this process, for this predictability framework, is to build on the trust we have been, I think, creating during these last years between different parts of the community, which is something, at least to my mind, very different to the situation we had in 2012, where we had a very siloed approach between different and important parts of the community, which led also to many emerging and unforeseen situations, which were resolved on an ad hoc manner with direct dialogue with org, with the board. So we have a good basis there, but we have to be mindful that probably the most important ingredient is the trust between the different parts of the community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I understand we have a couple of questions in the Zoom from remote participants. Justin, can I ask you to read out one?
Our first question comes from Rita Mole. Who will decide if one issue is the same as another issue? There are many shades of gray.
Karen, perhaps.
Hello, Marita. Thank you for the question. It's a good question, and we obviously considered this in developing our assumption that, you know, once we've brought an issue to the Spirit, we don't need to keep bringing the same issue. The question is, do we all agree that it's the same? And so I think essentially what would happen, you know, the process provides that we as the org can pose issues to the Spirit. And I think in that case that we believed this was a repetition of an issue that it had already looked at, that we would present it that way and say, this looks to us to be the same case as we addressed previously. And then they can confirm that it is indeed the same, or if they think it's different, continue with that discussion. So I think that's how that would occur.
Jeff.
Yeah, if I can add to that too, because it would be great to get a little bit more color on that question. But and I agree with Karen with everything Karen said, but I also want to add to that the intention for the Spirit is not to look at issues involved in like one application, right? It's really meant to be looking at more systemic type issues that apply, you know, to multiple applications. So I'm not sure how much the same issue would come up, because I guess if a couple applications were having an issue, then, you know, you'd have to look at it. And of course, we're generalizing here, but if two applications have an issue, then there's probably likely that others will. And then that's what sort of causes this, okay, we have an issue here we need to consider because it affects multiple applications. If it affects one application, I don't think that's what the Spirit was intended to kind of look at. It's not, at least in my mind, and I think it's consistent with the rest of the SubPro group, but I'm kind of going out on a limb on that one. So if I'm wrong, anyone's free to come up and point a different point of view. But I think the way we always approached it was that it wasn't issues in applications, it was issues in the whole process itself.
Chris, can you add?
Yes, thank you. I find this question interesting, and I agree with everything that Jeff and Karen said, but it occurs to me, I've got my operational hat on when I'm talking here. I would like to think of ways that we can minimize the impact operationally to what we do in these processes. So during the implementation of this, I'd really like to see us concentrate on those categorization criteria. We talked about the operational versus process, the non-minor, minor, and significant in impact. But I think there's other ways we can classify these and hopefully come up with a very clear way to understand why we would consider something the same as a prior issue that came up, so that we could minimize the times that we might come up with a disagreement on that. Thanks.
Thanks. Do we have a second question from the remote participants?
This question comes from Santanu Acharya. Is the council working on the fees structure also? Is there any, there are many not-for-profit organizations who may be helped through reduced fee structures?
Karen, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So I understand this question to be if there is an application process, is there work in progress on the fee structure? And the final report from the PDP working group did contain recommendations on the fee structure in terms of developing the application fees. And it also did contain recommendations for applicant support. So those are both topics that we are working on in the operational design phase based on the recommendations in the report. There is possibly, if you attend the GNSO Council meeting this week, a discussion about the council or the GNSO taking up the applicant support topic to perhaps provide some additional guidance. So maybe Jeff wants to add anything if you like.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would just also say that the GNSO, the council, wouldn't be involved in, setting fees or anything like that. And if you look at the recommendations in the final report, it was really guidance and policy about how ICANN.org should go about determining the fees. So kind of formulaic as opposed to saying that we think the price should be this and these entities should have these types of discounts. And it wasn't the policy process. Those aren't policy questions per se. Those were more to try to give guidance to ICANN.org, who ultimately has to figure out the whole cost of the program, which is part of this ODP process, and then figure out how, based on its assessment of how many applications it thinks it's going to get, to try to figure out application fees. But that's not something ultimately that the GNSO Council or the community, for that matter, will be involved in.
Yeah, thanks. So Justin, understand there are some hands raised. How do you want to take those?
We have one hand raised from Nitin Wali. I'm gonna allow you to speak and you can unmute your mic. You're permitted to speak, but your mic is still muted.
Yeah. Perhaps go to the next one.
We have another raised hand from Sebastian Bachelet. I'm going to allow you to speak right now. Please unmute your mic.
Actually, Sebastian can come to the microphone.
Bonjour, est-ce qu'on a la traduction, l'interprétation disponible? Ok, merci beaucoup. Donc Sébastien Bachelet, d'abord pour tester tout cet environnement exceptionnellement compliqué dans l'organisation du travail ici. Mais j'avais deux remarques à faire. La première, c'est que j'espérais que quand on parle de prédictabilité et de travail ensemble, la première chose qui viendrait, c'est ça commence quand le prochain appel à candidature des nouveaux gTLD? C'est ça la prédictabilité. Le deuxième, c'est je voulais savoir si, puisqu'il est mis en place une structure pour résoudre un certain nombre de problèmes, est-ce que vous utiliserez cette structure aussi pour résoudre les derniers backlogs qui restent dans le programme précédent? Merci.
Thank you very much. Not sure who can take this.
Merci Sébastien, ça fait plaisir de te revoir. But I'm going to do the rest in English. I'll struggle through the French otherwise. I'm going to start with the second question, whether the framework is there to address issues from the previous round. I think essentially it will depend on the issue. If the issue also impacts applications or the overall process of the next round, then I would expect, I'm looking to my colleagues, I have to admit we haven't discussed this hypothetical yet, that the framework then also be used for the next round to address those overhanging issues or remaining issues. As far as the start of the next round is concerned, Jeff talked about how looking at the fees is part of the ODP work. Similarly, I think to establish a timeline of when we expect the implementation work to reach a point where the applicant guidebook can be published and the application window can be opened, that is also going to be part of the ODP work. But I hasten to add, obviously, we will work as diligently as we can. Few things are more difficult to predict than the future, but yeah, it will be part of the ODA work. Thank you.
Jeff.
Yeah, I agree with Lars. I just want to take this opportunity because to remind everyone one other point of the predictability framework. So if people recall in the final report, SubPro final report, it talks about not just one round followed by, an indeterminate review period, but it talks about one round followed by the next round, followed by the next one without these, long indeterminate over-decade gaps. So one potential role for the Spirit team is to, and it sort of is brought up by Sebastian's question about looking at previous rounds. Obviously, for this next round, hopefully the SubPro team was able to look at all of the previous round issues and try to come up with some solutions for this coming round. But for subsequent rounds after that, since it's not envisioned to have, review periods in the middle, the Spirit team could likely be one of those tools to help address issues that arose during the previous round that you couldn't necessarily solve during that round, but which you could offer a solution for the following round. So I think to use Sebastian's question to say that this predictability model is, I wouldn't say a substitute at all for reviews, but it is a way of dealing with issues for the next round while reviews are going on, and that may take a much longer period of time.
Aubrey, to you next.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add one quick thing is, should this round go through, should this tool get built, we have to remember that one tool is not the solution to absolutely everything, and that there are other tools. And the notion of using a non-existing tool on problems that exist or may exist from the past is difficult to fathom. So it looks like a great possible tool, but I think we have to be careful to look at it in the context that Jeff put before. It's looking at future systemic issues and not necessarily past systemic issues, which are issues that were looked at by the PDP and will be looked at by org and IRPs and everything, IRTs and everything else in terms of building the next system. So it is not a tool for everything. When I read it, I don't see it as a tool that's a possible use for everything. Thanks.
Thanks. I want to go next to ask a question to everyone. The framework is intended to provide more transparency for applicants, the community, and ICANN organization. Can you talk about how this process may help build trust for different stakeholders? So open question, quite a large, Lars, to you.
Thanks, Patrick. I'll give it a go. I also saw a couple of questions in the chat that I'm maybe touching en passant as well. So the framework is there not to make predictions or to develop items that affect essentially make future decisions that affect the future, be it future rounds or other items, but to establish a predictable process to make changes to the existing program and process. So it's not a tool to kind of look ahead and be proactive in that sense, but to make sure that applicants understand how their application is affected by possible changes to the ongoing round at that moment. Obviously, those changes may well have an impact on future rounds if there are more than one and ongoing rounds as envisioned in the final report. And to Patrick's point on the collaboration, I think it goes to what Karen said as well. We hopefully will set up this program in a way together with the implementation review team, with the IRT, in a way that makes the program in itself already very predictable. The AGB, the applicant guidebook, will obviously lay out the process from application to post-delegation in hopefully a very predictable manner. And if there's issues that appear, be it due to applicants, I've just said, or other external factors that require changes, that we establish essentially a culture of cooperation with the ICANN org team and the community and the applicants as applicable to find suitable solutions that are timely and address the issue in an effective way, and also sustainable for that round and potential for future rounds as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Lars. Jorge, can I turn to you, and then I want to go to Chris and then Jeff. Jorge? I'd like to get your perspective on this building trust with the predictability framework.
Thank you. Yes, basically it goes back to what I said before, I think. It's a good basis to have it on paper, but then we have to put really flesh on the bones of this process, and really listen to each other whenever an issue emerges. So it's a very abstract discussion without having an issue, but we could imagine issues that could be similar to what we witnessed in the last round. Although a lot of work has been done, of course, to cover those in the recommendations, and hopefully in the applicant guidebook, to the extent that we minimize the use of this predictability framework and of the spirit. But in the end, I think it's really about very carefully listening to what the concerns are from each and every party involved in such an emerging issue, and the framework gives us a way of channeling that. But of course, it's first it's only channeling the issue, as is said in the recommendations. It doesn't provide for the solution itself, and the solution will be found by the different parts of the community involved, according to their roles and responsibilities. Thank you.
Jeff, I didn't mean to have someone go ahead of you, so please, can you go next? Jeff.
Yeah, the point I wanted to add about trust is to just, and I see a lot of people out there that were around for the 2012 round. I mean, there's a lot of new people, which is fantastic in the last decade, but I see a bunch of people that were applicants, and so they're going to know what I'm saying. You know, the whole reason we developed this, if you look at it today and just read it and haven't been involved weren't involved in the last round, you'd think this is really bureaucratic. This seems like so much excess. Like, why do we need all this? And you probably are thinking issues in terms of the bigger policy issues that you may have heard of, that, you know, like closed generics and some other like sensitive strings, you know, the big policy issues. But there were so many other things as an applicant that got changed from a much from either an operational perspective or just from a non-policy perspective that didn't necessarily, although people knew about it at the time, didn't really make most people's radar. So, for those that were involved, there was no process to handle it. And so applicants, when these issues came up, were just completely in the dark. And ICANN, as I think it was Aubrey had said, the board just had to deal with it. And the staff, I'm sure the staff worked with the board and they came up with something, but there was no insight at all from the community. There was no transparency. And so you had things like, for those of you who remember, and sorry for bringing back some nightmares, the final applicant guidebook was designed or was finalized in June of 2011. So when the board approved it. But in the guidebook, there was a provision that said that there would be a mechanism for prioritizing applications and batches that would be, I think the words were something like skills-based. It was very kind of, open. So that was in June of 2011. And so ICANN had to come up with something that was skills-based, and they came out with something called digital archery. That was approved on March 28, 2012, which was already 9 months after the final guidebook. Applications were already being submitted. And at that time, and I'll get into it brings up the second example, it was about 10 days from when the applications were due to be submitted. And that's when ICANN released its digital archery proposal. And so, okay, so that was now going to be it. And there were some pretty obvious flaws that people saw from the beginning, but it took some people to show ICANN what the flaws were. That if those people knew what ICANN was really contemplating, they could have pointed out, like in a spirit team, what those issues were without having the board go pass a resolution in March, accepting digital archery, and then in June 23rd, it was suspended because of what people knew already what the issues would be. And then, of course, they abandoned it like a week later. But then it took until November 2012 was when the proposed prioritization draw was finalized. So this is, let me do my math here, 18 months, well, it was implemented in December. So it was took 18 months from the drafting of the final guidebook to come up with what ultimately was applied. So, that's an example of where hopefully if the spirit team is successful and gets the people that are at least envisaged in as being members of experts, ICANN could kind of work with that team to just understand some of the implications before finalizing this type of process, right? So that's one example. We'll get to others later, I'm sure.
So thanks, Jeff. I think we are at the end of the session. Karen, can I turn to you for some last remarks and then thank everyone for joining today?
Yep, thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone for the questions and the comments. We've talked here about a variety of stakeholders within the ICANN community, as we all have different roles. That includes applicants, as Jeff has been reminding us. But it's also, I think it's also bigger than that, bigger than the current ICANN community. We're building this program, we're doing around to be able to support internet users around the world. And so the more that we can make a straightforward, predictable process and have tools to deal with changes, the better off we all are. Lastly, I'll just say, and I know it was, I know we're out of time, but if we didn't get to your question, if you have more questions or comments, come talk to us. We will be here around the week or all week. We will be around all week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Session is closed.